Welcome to Conversations. I'm Bill Kristol, and I'm very pleased to have as our guest today Harvey Mansfield, longtime professor of government at Harvard University. Welcome, Harvey.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Good to have you. Let's talk about party government.
Yes.
You wrote on that 50 years ago, great book on statesmanship and party government on Edmund Burke. Yuval Levin had a recent book which you've just reviewed, actually, in the Claremont Review of Books, also discussing Burke and political parties, though in a somewhat different way. So,
Yeah, my book was about the respectability of political parties. It had always been thought before Burke, Edmund Burke, who wrote at the end of the 18th century, that it was a bad thing to have parties. And if there were parties, there would be the respectable people on one side, the nobles or the gentlemen, and the plebs or the plebeians, the lower class, on the other side. And Burke changed that. He tried to argue that it was respectable for gentlemen or nobles to disagree. And this was the big step toward making party government as a whole, as a way of governing, a respectable thing to do. And so that was what my book was about.
And why was that a good idea, according to Burke, or necessary?
It was a good idea because, in fact, people do disagree. And when they disagree, it's good that they have some responsibility for their disagreement. And this means that you shouldn't just disagree as an individual, but you should disagree as a group. And there should be a kind of collective responsibility of the group for the policies that they're taking a risk on together. And otherwise, if individuals are merely used by the king or by the government to bring into the cabinet and to make them ministers, that merely satisfies individual ambition and doesn't make it responsible. To be responsible, it has to be collective. So that was the general picture of Burke's argument. Now, this recent book by Yuval Levin looks at the debate between Edmund Burke and Tom Paine, was a kind of citizen of America and of other countries too, of France, a kind of world citizen before that idea got started.
Right.
And he was the liberal and Burke was the conservative. So here you have a picture of the two parties as they were at the time of the French Revolution. The liberals, those who wanted to see expansion of liberty and especially of equality, and Burke, who stood against that. He wanted to stand in favor of liberty more than equality, and he wanted to keep government in the hands of the gentlemen, of those who were, by their position, made more responsible for the decisions that they took. So Levin says that this debate between Burke and Paine was the beginning of our liberals and conservatives, and I think he argues that quite well and brings it right up to the present. Now, I was thinking about this in the review that I did of Levin's book, and it occurred to me that there is another way to look at the two parties, and that is in the way of Aristotle or the way of Tocqueville, as between the Democrats, those who, Tocqueville said, those who want to extend the power of the people, and the oligarchs, the party of the few, those who want to restrict the power of the people. Now, I think looking at it today, perhaps I'm just thinking this out now, there are these dual party systems that we operate under. And the first is under the liberals versus conservatives, and there the advantage goes to the liberals. The liberals stand for progress. They're progressives. Progress means that you take a step forward towards, it's unclear what, but probably, usually, or maybe always, towards equality. They want to make more equality. Democracy to them does not stand still, but it's always moving forward towards ever greater democracy, understood as more equality, to some extent more liberty, but especially equality. And the conservatives resist. And their resistance has the character of reaction. They react to what the progressives do. the progressives act first. They initiate, going ever further in the direction of greater equality. Now, progress has this several characters, and perhaps the first is that it's irreversible. It isn't progress unless you can't go back. And so when President Obama said, introducing his health care law, he said, I want to be the first president who's taken this up, and also the last. Right. And that I thought was very significant. He wanted to, he was a true progressive in that. He wanted to bring up health care and remove it, deal with it in such ways to remove it from policy or political dispute, and make it a matter of administration thereafter. This was something that would become an entitlement, as we say, right. That is a right, and therefore permanent, and not something that would be discussable afterwards. Or if it is discussable, at least it would be, the discussion would take place to the advantage of progressives, as you want to reverse what we've done. You want to go back to the 19th century. Right. You can't do that. So progress is irreversible.
Can't turn the clock back.
You can't turn the clock
That's
back.
A perfect phrase for that, isn't
yes,
it?
Yeah, it is. It is. As if you couldn't.
Yeah, right, right.
Actually, we turn the clock back twice a year. But that is indisputable, or it heads toward administration of policies which are no longer to be disputed. Now, but the trouble is that progress is not quite so sure where progress is, or what progress is toward, because progress would seem to require an end state in your mind, which is the perfect state or situation or condition to be in. And so a progressive is moving toward that state, and that's how he knows that he's a progressive. You don't know that you have progress unless you know, and you're quite sure where you're going to end up. But it's characteristic of progressives that they don't know where they're going to end up. They don't even know what the next stage is in progress. So they're all for equality of the races, but they don't realize that the next stage is equality of the sexes. And the same thing, they don't realize when they're talking about the equality of the sexes that means, will lead to equality of heterosexual and homosexuals. And so it's always a surprise, right, that just over the horizon, there's this other great inequality which has not yet been addressed and needs to be addressed, and needs to be equalized and dealt with in some way. Now, the way in which it's dealt with, here's another problem, is through a government program. The government program is a program of administration. And it turns out that the administration of what is called big government, or the immense being by Tocqueville, is not easy to accomplish. It suffers from what Steve Tellis, a political scientist, calls kludgeocracy. Mm-hmm. So you would see, going back again to the Health Care Act, you would think that here is this new great program full of innovation and benefit to the American people. You would think that they would take great pains to make sure that it worked when it was rolled out, and yet they couldn't. And the problem, perhaps generally, is that government has to obey rules of due process, and this gets them involved in contradictions with efficiency. Anyway, the administration of the progressive ideal is always in question. And then another problem is that we're headed towards is you run out of money. Yeah, as Margaret Thatcher famously said, you run out of other people's money to give away.
Right.
Yeah. So government makes a habit of living off other people's money, and that's in many ways justice, but it also means that there is a limit that the progressives don't really appreciate or underestimate. On the other hand, it's possible to overestimate the importance of a limit or the nearness of it, because Republicans are always saying we can't afford this and we can't afford that, and it turns out that we can afford it, or for much longer than people think. Now one wonders, will there be some kind of crash in which the government debt falters and some great disaster occurs, in which it becomes evident to everybody that this whole progressive agenda won't work. That is probably a dream to suppose that, but it certainly could happen that that they would run out of money, and that way sort of run out of money. Now, so that's the progressives, and they have this advantage because, as they say, there's a ratchet effect in progress. Since you can't go back, all the conservatives can do is to swallow the advances that are proposed, and to suggest reasonable or prudent qualifications or modifications. In other words, as Newt Gingrich famously said too, to become tax collectors for the welfare state, and to make their enemies into responsible politicians by securing that what they do is viable instead of just infinitely costly. So, and that puts the conservatives always, I think, on the defensive and in a difficult position. Now, that isn't, however, the only way to look at things.
So that's the Paine book.
That's the Paine Burke.
And you would say generally, if the Joder Deer sits,
on the whole, that's to the advantage of the left
and the
progressives.
The Burkean forces are always saying slow down. But
they're always saying slow down, but always in retreat.
Right.
And that seems to be a permanent characteristic of the left-right party division. But then if you look to the other party division, which is not modern, but comes out of Aristotle, a different picture emerges, and that's a division between democracy and oligarchy. And in Aristotle, he shows this in Book 3 of his Politics, where he's defining what a citizen is. And he first has a democratic citizen give a democratic definition, which is that the city as a whole, which includes everybody. And that's really the democratic view, that everybody should be included. Everybody is a member of the whole. The whole doesn't leave out anyone. And you see that today in the demand for inclusiveness in the Democrats and the progressives. But then in this debate as to what a citizen is, an oligarchical citizen intervenes, and he says, but some citizens are better than others. And that's a crucial point. Some citizens have the capacity to be citizens, because to be a citizen isn't just to live without any qualifications or without doing anything. A citizen is somebody who rules or who shares in rule, and it's not easy to do that. And not everybody is qualified. So you have to distinguish between those who are qualified and those aren't. And the whole of the Democrats just consists of homogeneous quantities of single individuals who are all alike. And that isn't the way society is. Society is graded into ranks, and you see that in the way that everybody admires those who are really good at something. It's not possible to be a human being and simply live with what's today called empathy, as if everyone were equal and nothing is outstanding. And the only thing to do is, the only thing you need to do is to include everyone. You also need to admire and to respect those who you think are admirable, those who can do things better than you can. It's not possible to be a human being and not admire better human beings than yourself. So, that I think that fact can be the basis for conservative cheer. So that it isn't just a matter of always retreating, but they've got this permanent fact of human nature, that virtue is something admirable, and that you can. Now, of course, the Republicans live in a modern age, which is a democratic age, and so they have to democratize this understanding of virtue, and that's not always easy for them to do, but they do their best at it. Even Abraham Lincoln spoke of a free person, a free man, as a worker, somebody whose work deserves to get the rewards of his own work, and that's still an element of the Republican liking of virtue, to respect those who earn a living or those who work for that, as opposed to people who are just on welfare and get a welfare check. And you see it also in immigration, that the Republicans, it's arguably in their interest to adopt a free and open policy towards immigrants or illegal immigrants, but they don't. They can't really. It really bothers them that millions of people came here illegally, not obeying the law. That's not virtuous. And a country will get into trouble if it doesn't reward virtue, or if it rewards lack of virtue. So the Republicans, even though virtue is aristocratic in its essence, nonetheless look for ways to find democratic virtue. And they can't keep themselves from adopting a certain tone of not superciliousness, but at least superiority, which the Democrats always take advantage of. And the Republican is a little bit stuffy. And fundamentally, this is because he has certain things that he values or believes in, and he can't help being, as we say, judgmental. So the fact that human beings are necessarily judgmental, I think, is an aid to conservatives, and a way in which this more fundamental, I would say it's more fundamental party division between democracy and oligarchy underlies the more relevant, or say more trendy division of modernity between liberals and conservatives.
And the Liberal Party tends to be the Democratic Party as well. It seems somehow progress always seems to be towards equality. I mean, I suppose in theory one could have a oligarchic or aristocratic theory of progress, but it doesn't seem to ever quite work out that way.
Yes, you could. Yeah. You would have a progress which rewards the people who most contribute to progress. And Republicans pick up on that. Right. Entrepreneurial spirit.
Right.
Entrepreneurial spirit, that's their understanding of virtue, or an understanding of virtue. And so, so they can buy into the notion of progress in that way.
But do you think, sort of, following Burke, they do have to sort of resist the idea of progress to some degree? That seems to be a tension among today's conservatives. Do they want to say that liberalism doesn't work, that a better understanding of progress would mean freer markets, or letting rich people become rich so they can help the society more? Or, I mean, how much should conservatives sign on to progress? I think that's a practical question.
That is a practical question for them, yeah. In that way, you could say that the two divisions sort of contradict each other, or one doesn't overlay easily on the other.
Right.
And so, the conservatives do, in fact, today have to buy into progress and not merely resist it, but on the other hand, they can't buy into it altogether.
And I guess intellectually they can't delude themselves about it. I think that's
Right.
So in that respect, Tocqueville is a better guide than Burke, or would you go that far? Or
Yes, I think maybe that's right. Yeah, that see, Burke lived before, just before it became necessary to be a Democrat with a small d, which I guess and he perhaps realized that at the very end of his life, that the French Revolution was making a change that was in fact irreversible and would create a new era of democracy to which all parties would have to comply. Yeah, I think it may have happened that way. And so Tocqueville's a better guide for us, since he wants to give the French aristocrats a cold bath of reason to make them see that democracy is here to stay, and that I think is also works for sort of potential oligarchs or aristocrats in our time as well.
I mean, I think Levin in his book also emphasizes the degree to which, I mean, Burke, of course, was a great friend and defender, supporter, really, of the American Revolution. But his account, the way he presents the American Revolution, at least in Britain at the time,
Yeah.
is not really the way we think of it, I would say. It's as a conservative revolution.
That was it, yes.
Upholding the rights
Yes.
of Englishmen. He
Upholding
never
rights
seems
of-
to have talked or
Yeah.
written much about the Declaration, I think. I mean,
That's right. I don't know that he ever mentioned it.
right.
Yeah. And that he shares with Tocqueville, by the way.
Well, that's true.
Yeah. But Tocqueville mentions the principle of the Declaration, which he doesn't care for.
And why is that? So let's talk about that. But isn't that hard? And so even Tocqueville's accommodation to democracy is,
Yeah.
is
I mean,
limited in a sense.
Yes, of course. Yes, it has to be, because democracy by itself is a runaway train towards it doesn't know what. Because the analysis I gave before of progressivism really comes from Tocqueville. Progressivism aims not towards what is perfect, but towards what is perfectible. So you always think that what you've done is an improvement. It's like next year's car model. So you've got the 2014 car now, that must be perfect. But no, the next one will be better. But what is the perfect car? See? So it doesn't seem that there is one. And that's Tocqueville's criticism, that people are just going headlong. Now, and they're made to go more headlong by democratic theories. And democratic theories depend on the principle of the Declaration of Independence, which is all men are created equal. And Tocqueville mentions that, but he says it comes from Jesus Christ and not from the Declaration of Independence. So that gives it a certain historical or touch and religious respectability. So to come back to Burke, yes, you see the same thing in Burke. He stays away from the principle of the American Revolution as the Americans saw it, which is how Thomas Paine saw it.
Right.
And so he actually really opposes that, but he keeps quiet about it. I guess in the hope that these Englishmen over here, that's what we are,
Right.
will get sensible and behave as if we were Englishmen.
But the hope that Democrats won't appeal, or that citizens in a democracy won't appeal to abstract ideas of equality and rights, that seems hard to sustain.
Yes.
After the last
it is.
few decades.
It is very hard to sustain. See, Tocqueville tries to calm this desire for abstract equality by showing what real equality is in practice. And that's why his book is called Democracy in America. It's not just democracy, and it's not just America, but it's this theory, and he does speak of democracy as a theory, as practiced in a certain place. And there you see that the practice has the quality in general of qualifying theoretical abstractions. It's all very well to speak of Democrats sharing in rule, but how do they do it? And so that's how he gets into the idea of town government, which you get near the beginning of democracy in America, that people get together spontaneously in order to solve some common problem. You're living sort of with a bunch of other people, and you want to build a road. One person can't do that. So you have to get together to do it, and to do it you need a little bit of an organization, a kind of formal organization. So all this is showing how equality, just as an abstraction, doesn't go far enough, or doesn't really tell you what needs to happen. Or the jury. When you're on a jury, you realize that the law, which is a very general proposition, applies to actual human beings.
Right.
And it becomes your duty to judge whether a particular human being is going to go to jail or not, because of you, because of your thinking. And so this forces you really to think more seriously about what the law requires, and how it's applicable to particular human beings. See, democracy has a great passion for passing laws. But what does it look like when you actually apply them? So this is the way in which Tocqueville tries to deal with or handle the abstractions of democratic theory.
Yeah, make people be practical about what works and what has worked,
Yes,
and be
yeah.
respectful of these institutions, I suppose, too.
Yes, right. That's right. Respectful of institutions, and especially which he calls forms. This is a kind of Aristotelian or Platonic expression, that forms and formalities of liberty are very, very important. It's what we today call due process.
Right.
That you have to do it the right way, and the right way is usually the slow way, and slow is right on the threshold of deliberate, and deliberate is right on the threshold of reasonable. So when you're slowed down by having to do it right, you might do it more reasonably or more sensibly than if you rush impulsively to do something right away, like lynch a criminal without giving him a proper trial. So, and democracy has this impulsiveness about it and impatience about that. You see that in foreign policy, how America always wants things to happen quickly. If it doesn't happen right away, we get war weary.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And Tocqueville's actual view of parties seems more from Aristotle than
More from Aristotle, yes, than from Burke and Paine. Because his actual view, he says that there are great parties throughout history, and he describes them, as I said before, those who want to extend the power of the people versus those who want to restrict it.
And those parties go all the way back, apparently, in his account?
Yeah. That's in every free country.
So that's not a phenomenon of modern democracy.
No, but you see, he's rephrased it. Aristotle has a democracy versus oligarchy. And in Tocqueville, the oligarchy becomes those who want to restrict the power of the people. It doesn't say those who want to assert the power of the few.
Right.
Which would be more, but behind the reasoning of restriction is the essence of fewness, because when you're talking about admiration or respect, those whom you admire and whom you most respect tend to be few.
And Tocqueville doesn't talk that much, as I recall, about particular American politicians or founders, but I do think he has that really striking, doesn't he, praise of the Federalist Party or the Federalist
Party
figures who...
Yes, that's right. He doesn't mention or go into particular names, but as a party they were aristocratic, he says. And America had the great fortune to be founded by an aristocracy. He doesn't quite say it that way,
right,
but you can infer it from what he does say, and quite a few other little aristocratic remarks are scattered through democracy in America, which come up to something quite impressive if you add them up.
Without ever having an explicit defense of...
Of aristocracy. No, definitely not. Aristocracy cannot defend itself in its own name. It has to defend itself as contributing to democracy, as necessary to democracy. And I think that's pretty much what Republicans try to do now, without perhaps fully realizing it.
Right, maybe they'd be better off if they realized more what they were
Yes,
doing,
I
thoughtful about.
Yeah, I think, yes, that's right. They're too American. They're too democratic. That means to understand themselves rightly.
That's what they need to read.
They need
Tocqueville,
to read Tocqueville.
Aristotle, or
Yes.
Aristotle's too ambitious?
Yes. Aristotle's too ambitious, so read Tocqueville. That's it. Yeah.
We've been talking about Tocqueville as a philosopher or a political philosopher, but I guess the obvious question to ask is, well, he doesn't look like he writes as a political philosopher. He admired Rousseau, and others mentions Descartes, but he doesn't look like Descartes or Rousseau, to say nothing of Hobbes or Plato and other such. So why that?
I think Tocqueville was a philosopher, a very deep and learned man. His learning he wears very lightly, and he doesn't like to make reference to other philosophers, but he occasionally uses philosophic expressions like the term first cause, and also like the term forms or formalities. But he's not the first philosopher to be wary about philosophy. And certainly I think Machiavelli fits into that category, and you could even say Aristotle. Begin with Plato. Plato is the philosopher who made his theme the philosophic way of life. All his dialogues are about Socrates or somebody like Socrates arguing and making philosophy present and primary. The main thing you have to do with your life is to think, and to think like a philosopher. Hence the famous equation virtue equals knowledge. Right. So that's very prominent in Plato. And Aristotle, his student, comes along and wonders about whether it's a good idea to make philosophy one's open theme. And so even in Aristotle already, the great philosopher, the man who was called the philosopher by Thomas Aquinas, philosophy is much less prominent in his writings than it is in Plato. And actually, if you want to make or think about what is more prominent, it's moral virtue. Or Aristotle makes moral virtue, which he actually says is second to philosophical virtue, the theme of his books on politics and ethics and how to live. It's as if philosophy gets in the way of morality, that there's such a thing as trying to be too good, which will end by making you another philosopher, perhaps an incompetent philosopher, instead of being the effective ruler or gentleman or citizen that you might otherwise be. So Aristotle, you could say, has these doubts. And I think Tocqueville, in his way, shares them. For him, philosophy is bad because in the democratic age, philosophy is democratic. Philosophy encourages democracy, and that's an example of that is Descartes. Descartes, when you read him, doesn't look at all to be like a democratic philosopher, but he introduced the principle that everybody should apply reason. You should doubt all authority, and all authority is questionable, and you should look for what is undoubted or what doesn't need to be, what survives doubt. And so, and that principle, which is meant to be originally for philosophers, becomes political and moral when it's applied to the ordinary person. It tells him that his reason is as good as anyone else's reason, and that he doesn't have to listen to any authority, and that is the democratic principle or the democratic dogma Tocqueville calls it. And so you find that over and over again. And the main trouble with the democratic theorists is that they're materialists. There's a kind of affinity between democracy and materialism. What is that? Well, in a democracy, everybody's equal. That means nobody is an authority for me. I'm as good as anyone else. But I need something to guide me. And so I look around, and there are these other people who are equal to me. So the other people, the majority opinion, tends to become the authority in a democracy. And that's a very dubious thing. It's not that authority can be done away with. Authority is necessary for human life. You always have to believe that there's some principle that's bigger or better than you are, that you're following. So you can't really get rid of it, and what you do is then what is the authority, or what does the majority want to do? It doesn't want to do something which is far off into the future, and which requires a lot of sacrifice and effort, because that means you have to trust the principle that you're believing in to produce some beautiful result. And so a cathedral, say, may take centuries to make.
Right.
Yeah, and you're always, but it's something that sort of beautiful in your mind, in your imagination, that you're devoted to. But that, you see, takes belief in God or a belief in the church. Whereas if you're believing in what the majority wants something close and immediate and satisfying, and all that means materialism in practice. So that's the affinity between democracy and materialism, and the democratic philosophers encourage this affinity instead of discouraging as they ought to. Men have souls, or at least men need to believe that they have souls. But let's say that men have souls. Tocqueville speaks about degraded souls at the beginning of democracy in America. So you can't, without a soul, you can't really be free, because you're not free if you're always being moved by some external force. And so the philosophers or the historians or the social scientists of our day try to find these external forces, grand historical forces that actually end up by making each person on whom they impinge feel impotent. You feel as if you're a kind of victim, and there's nothing you can do. And this is the great problem of a mass society, that there's you're forced into your individuality because you don't feel that there's any way you can accomplish anything with anyone else. So the only thing you can do is to sort of shut yourself up in your family or with your friends. And this is what Tocqueville calls individualism. So individualism and materialism go together, and both of them also go together with big government. Big government is the government that brings you the material benefits that your materialism makes you desire, but also leaves you unsatisfied with. Unsatisfied because man is fundamentally a spiritual or soulful being. And so you have to think that there's some meaning in yourself which is beyond your material, and which therefore might survive your death. You can survive your death. So this is, so to say, the fundamental notion of a soul, and Democrats have a big problem with that, and
I guess
Tocqueville tries to help them.
And I guess one way he tries to help them is, doesn't he call it a doctrine himself, the doctrine of self-interest, well understood?
Yes. Well, he says that's the American doctrine. So,
right.
Yeah. So
but he interprets it in a
yeah,
certain
he
way.
interprets it. Yeah, self-interest well understood, and that's see that's a little bit ambiguous. that well understood.
Right.
Does that mean that everything good can be understood as self-interest? Or does it mean that you have to have some community interest which is separate from your self-interest, and that's what makes your self-interest well understood?
He does, at least I think, try pretty obviously to show that if you think through your self-interest, you should be led to a longer time horizon.
Yes.
And then he has that even
That's right.
long and
Yeah.
roundabout way. It brings you back to
Yes, to community interest or to
then
the common
religion
good.
even. Into
Yes,
the, yeah.
and religion comes in too, yeah.
So,
Religion tells you that you have a soul and that this gives you something to devote yourself to, which is not material. It's your self just doesn't capture it, because your self
Right.
doesn't seem to have any authority over yourself, but your soul does. That's something that or you could also say your character, to live so as to have a fine character and to show it in your actions. That's what a democracy should be about, according to Tocqueville.
and the public presentation of philosophy, or his dealing with philosophers and
Yeah.
philosophic doctrines,
Yeah. So
that
he
wouldn't be helpful. I mean,
is mainly, that's right. So he makes fun of the materialists. He says that they think that human beings are of little or no importance, and yet they think that they themselves are very important. So this kind of contradiction, which is not exactly a refutation of materialism, but is a comment on the behavior, which is true, I think, of materialist philosophy. So he doesn't argue directly with it, sort of on a philosophical level. He doesn't want to take them on the level of philosophy, but that I guess what he's really showing is that philosophy can find itself in things which are below philosophy, in what you might call sub-philosophy, or in politics. You can find philosophy in politics, and that I think is very Greek, very Platonic, and very Aristotelian at the same time.
I guess the only thinker maybe that you've written more about than Tocqueville is Machiavelli.
Yeah.
Another thinker who, it occurs to me, you consider a philosopher, but
Yeah.
Most of the world doesn't, and doesn't present himself as such, I guess. So
That's right. I think that Machiavelli is a philosopher. This was first shown, and very clearly, by Leo Strauss in his great book, Thoughts on Machiavelli. And so I sort of follow on Strauss, but try to study a few things that he left generously for people for his followers to work out for themselves. And Machiavelli also, I think, was a philosopher. He spoke of the world and of knowers of the world. And I think he tried to reduce the object of philosophy to the world, meaning the visible world, or even the tangible world. What you can touch is the most reliable part of your experience. So I think that this statement of Machiavelli's, in which he speaks of the world, led to the early modern epistemology, which tries to confine human knowledge to what is available to us from our senses, rather than from our imagination or from our reasoning out of what we imagine things might be at their best. And so Machiavelli has this famous paragraph, first paragraph in chapter 15 of The Prince, in which he speaks of the necessity of going to the effectual truth of the thing rather than to the imagination of it. So what people need to do is look at how fine words come out in practice. The fine words of Plato came out in the fine words of St. Augustine, as Plato's idea of the good was understood by St. Augustine, or transformed by St. Augustine, into the idea of God, or the city of God. And the idea of the city of God, in effect, is the church, and the Christian church and all its nefarious practices, which Machiavelli exposes and admires to some extent and wants to imitate or adopt to his own purposes. So when people talk fine about utopias, pay attention to what those words will actually produce in practice, and that would be the effectual truth, the effects of a thing. So he too speaks of parties, like Burke, and he says that the Roman Republic was characterized by these party disputes between the nobles and the plebs, and the Roman historians like Livy or the philosophers looked down on this. They thought that a republic is a bad republic if it isn't harmonious. The party should get together. And Machiavelli says, no, you have to look at the effects. And the effects were that Rome was made free and strong by its party disputes, rather than
internal competition.
Internal competition, yes, the bringing out the opportunities for ambition, the very nasty tricks that were performed by both sides, by the tribunes and by the nobles. That was good. That made Rome stronger, allowed it to become an empire. It was good that it was a republic that became an empire. That was not a bad transformation. Caesar only did what he had to do at the time. So the effects were good, and that is the standard by which you should judge theories. And Machiavelli, again, doesn't want to argue this out with Plato and St. Augustine or anybody else, any other philosopher. But he refers in many ways surreptitiously to philosophical doctrines and sort of gives them expression as, for example, the French. So you have to think, who were the French in his time? And they have certain characteristics, and if you imagine a little bit, you can see that he's using the French as a kind of concept of people who believe in a certain way, and so he has this kind of half-secret machinations of philosophy underneath the surface of his writing, but still he doesn't really refute them except by inference. He wants to rub your nose in the dirtiness of dirty politics and make you see what harm moralism, or a high moral virtue, such as Aristotle presented for us, the splendor of moral virtue, how that has been interpreted and misrepresented and put into practice, evil practice, by the church.
And how do we know that the effectual truth is true? I mean, that he's right about that?
Yeah, that is. I think that is a problem with Machiavelli. Is all truth effectual truth, you might ask? And I think the answer has to be no. That there has to be a certain plain truth in order to look at whether effectual truth has actually been effectual or not. So you sort of step outside Machiavelli in order to judge Machiavelli, which is what he's asking. He's saying that effectual is better. He says, I'm bringing the common good, say, of humanity to each human being. He promises that. Each of us will get something good out of this, that's the beginning of our modern individualism. That's a kind of promise, not to peoples, not to Italians, not to Florentines, but to ciascuno, each. That's really quite remarkable and a remarkable step in his philosophical thinking. So, but you have to. Each person then would have to be, or at least have the capacity to judge whether it really is a benefit. And if you look at the 20th century, I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that it hasn't been a benefit, and that the atheist regimes of the 20th century, Nazism and communism, are really worse than anything we ever saw in religious persecution or religious civil war, bloody and often unreasonable as that was.
But I suppose you would say, or one could say, that modern science, modern medicine, at the end of the day, the benefits dwarf the slight problems that have happened along the way.
That's right. That's right. And then, and we put those things behind us.
Right.
Yeah. That's a delusion, I think.
Yeah.
It's a delusion. We have modern medicine, but we also have modern nuclear bombs.
Right.
So for the first time, man has a capacity to destroy himself as a species. And so maybe not very likely, but it's definitely possible. And that's hardly a welcome idea.
And Machiavelli didn't believe then in sort of automatic progress. I mean, you think that.
That's right. Yeah, yes, he did believe in progress. He believed that his way of thinking was certainly progress over the old way of Plato and Aristotle and of Thomas Aquinas. But to him, I think there's always a belief in virtue, in human virtue, in virtu, and that's pretty much confined to a few, especially great doers. So he always has greatness in mind. And I forgot to say, by the way, that Tocqueville also has greatness in mind. And both of them have it, however, that greatness is not, or doesn't seem to be, philosophy. So, or doesn't have to be. But both of them were great philosophers.
And Machiavelli would, I suppose, suggest that these men of virtue would always be required somehow to guide modernity, even as things are chugging along.
Yeah.
And
he remarks at some point that nature supplies a few virtuous men. It's not that there's no natural provision. We can count on that. But how they survive or prevail is another matter. That is up to us. And so we need to, you could say that his doctrine is meant to reproduce conditions in which virtue can excel and express itself. And this would mean, of course, especially the virtue of a few. So you could say the greatness of the human race is confined to the few great. That's in Machiavelli, but on the other hand, he's more democratic too than that would seem, because the greatness that he wants comes about by appeal to the people. So in general, his advice to a prince is make friends with the people. They're better friends for you than other princes or other nobles. They're the ones who are ambitious like you and will try to push you out if you don't push them out first. And perhaps the greatest virtue of a democratic people for Machiavelli is its hatred of nobles and its desire for revenge against them. So we say he likes republics because they have more hatred and more revenge in them.
Yeah. Now, I think you've written that out of effectual truth comes the fact-value distinction, which is so important in modernity. Though Machiavelli does not seem to be a believer in that distinction. I mean, he certainly recommends things that are good for man. True.
And well, I've been thinking about that recently, and I think that Machiavelli had this notion of effectual truth. He certainly didn't believe in the fact-value distinction as we have it. That's true. as we have it, that distinction says that science is about facts and science is not about values. So your values are your own, and you can't impose them on other people because they're not a matter of knowledge. They're a matter of emotion or something which is not reason or not knowledge. But I think that Machiavelli's effectual truth has led, over the 5 centuries since he wrote that, to our fact-value distinction. And just the word fact is interesting. The Greeks didn't use that. They spoke of the that, but they didn't speak of fact. Fact is something close to what Machiavelli spoke of as effectual. It's something you cannot deny, and it's also something that gets in your way. So facts are especially stubborn facts, or occasionally brute facts. They're not, you can't reason about them. You can't take them and try to imagine them as better than they are in order to arrive at the perfect tree, say. You look at a tree, and you're really, the fact of a tree is just what it is and how it looks, the perception of it. And you can't work your way from that to the definition of a tree, or like as if it were a Platonic form. So reason has to accept that facts exist, or as we say today, data. Data means given, things that are given, the givens. And so that's, I think, pretty much what Machiavelli meant. And I'm not sure whether the word effectual leads to the word fact. Fact, well, from Latin would just be facere, a deed, a deed. And Machiavelli uses it as a human thing. Now we speak of fact as of things as well as human doings or deeds or like that. Yeah, so with the Greeks you have deeds versus speech, whereas with the moderns you have facts versus values, and that's now just to look at the fact-value distinction, I think is interesting, and I think one could, in order to work ourselves out of this notion that everything that we desire is unreasonable or cannot be defended by reason or justified by reason, we need to come back to something like what Plato and Aristotle thought. And you could do this from an example, which I like to use. It sounds as if it's against Ohio State, but when I was a boy, my father was a professor at Ohio State, and I finished up high school in Columbus. And my father used to tell a kind of joke or wry jest that was passed around among the Ohio State faculty. And it went like this: how many students are there at Ohio State? Answer, about 1 in 100. So it's not an uproarious laugh, but still, now that's full of interest and wisdom, I think. In the first place, it's a faculty joke directed against the administration. The administration of Ohio State is so proud, well, this was half a century ago, that Ohio State has 50,000, say, students registered. But if you divide by 100, then it isn't quite as big as people like to think it is. And also, it's kind of oligarchic, because just as in Aristotle, the oligarchic citizen says only the most capable citizens are really citizens, so this joke says that only students who really study instead of go to parties and football games are really students. Right. And so from the standpoint of the faculty perspective on this, the 1 in 100 is the real fact. And I think, that's already saying that the reality of the thing isn't so much what is visible What is visible is that 50,000 students have signed up with the registrar, and so and they paid their dues or their tuition, and so yeah, and that's important, obviously, if you're a manager of the dining hall, and you know how many students you're going to have to feed. But it's more important because to make the distinction, because what Ohio State is there for is for students to study. That's the real purpose of the institution. So, and you get that purpose is really connected to the fact, but it's also a kind of critique of the fact as it exists. And so, according to the fact-value distinction, you would have to say the 1 in 100 is just a value, and that's what the professors are evaluating their students, and there's no...
By some arbitrary standards.
Yeah, that's right. And so, but no, there's a connection between the fact and the, quote, value, unquote. It's that the value is the real fact. So, and this, just as Plato said, what is invisible is more real than what is visible. Yeah. Now the thing is, the trouble is that the 1 in 100 may not be exact, and different professors would dispute which of them is a real student and or belongs to the 1, and which to the 100. And so that's what is invisible is not as indisputable as what is visible and is therefore a fact. But our social science, or political science, needs to become more tolerant and more knowing about its critics. And the critics are just like those who look on from the faculty perspective, who say that, here you've made this survey of perceptions, saying, no, you haven't. You've made a survey of what people think are perceptions. Among those, what you call perceptions are many misperceptions. And so, and you're responsible for that. I mean, because how can you just leave it that people are relaying to you their delusions and you call them perceptions? And this came up in a funny way in an article that I wrote for the Weekly Standard a couple of years ago on sexism. There's a couple of psychologists in New Zealand wrote an article on sexism in New Zealand. They'd made a big survey of college students in New Zealand, and they found that the women defer to the men, and the men like it that way and like to take the initiative. And they call this benevolent sexism, or BS for short. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this, however, was astonished them, as these psychologists said, that New Zealand is a very equal country. How can these women be satisfied with less than full equality? There must be hidden underneath this benevolent sexism, HS, which is hostile sexism. And so they decided at the end of their paper, which is still rather short, that everything that they had found and spent their money to acquire was wrong. Right. All they'd done was to uncover a great delusion of New Zealand college women, and they ended up wanting to warn these people against the result of their own so in other words, these social scientists, when it came to something they felt strongly about, couldn't stop themselves with the mere fact, quote unquote, and had to investigate, which they quickly did, as to whether it really was a fact that they were uncovering.
And I suppose in the case of the Ohio State students, one could argue that you can't really even understand the category student without understanding what the purpose of being a student is, and therefore ranking among students.
That's right.
So that it's the fact.
Yeah.
It can't just be the the value is somehow mixed in with the fact
That's right.
of the category.
It is. So you're really taking a value position when you think you're describing a fact.
Right.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to voting, then you see the problem. Democracy says one vote is as good as any other, but political scientists often distinguish between informed voters and uninformed voters.
Right.
And that's still making that oligarchical or aristocratic, supercilious distinction or grading among those whom they ought to be ranking equally.
Right.
So, so if you're serious about what it is to vote, that means that you would not be a voter when you're voting on the basis of, or declaring your vote on the basis of a whim, or of ignorance, or of passion. You would have to be really quite wise in order to vote well. But voting well is the same thing as voting. That's of the value hidden in every fact. To do is to do well, and so you might end up that only one person was a real voter in the whole electorate, and that's not very democratic. So, which means that the fact-value distinction has its purposes, mainly a political purpose or a moral purpose. That there are certain things for which we want to take people as equals, and other things where we want to rank them. But you shouldn't get all hot and bothered if people criticize your facts as containing hidden values. There is a difference between the way things are and the way they ought to be, and that's the common sense which is behind the fact-value distinction. But I think it's wrong to say that reason or science is involved in one and not in the other.
I mean, I suppose the democratic response to the low information versus high information voter, those are themselves, of course, democratic terms instead of saying more intelligent or less intelligent voters.
That's right.
I guess would be, I think this is from Hobbes, isn't it? Or maybe it's before even, that, well, the shoe pinches. Everyone can tell how the shoe pinches. You don't need to be smarter or less smart.
That's
and
right.
So you want to register that vote, so to speak, and that's an equal.
That's right.
Equal hurt from shoe pinching. So
that's right.
Each individual
the consumer. The consumer is the best judge of the meal, and not the chef.
Right.
Yeah. So and so that makes good sense.
But that too is a value judgment, I suppose.
It is.
You should weigh the common pain from the shoe pinching.
It's just saying that no, not all virtue is not confined to a few, but there are some virtues which many people have,
or some interests,
or which some right.
Are they virtues though, or are they just
you're
pains or difficulties?
Well, you're saying that judgment is to be trusted, that your shoe pinches.
So that's
better than the shoemaker who says no, it doesn't.
Right. Or in the long run, it'll be better for you.
In the long run, yes, it'll be better.
Social science.
Yeah.
Like Obamacare,
That's right.
You don't like losing your plan, but it'll end up better for everyone. That's sort of in this respect, the Democrats, the liberals, the progressives are making the more,
they are
oligarchic or aristocratic argument in a certain sense, right? Against a populist reaction that, this doesn't seem good to me.
Yeah. Rational control is the idea behind progress, that we can live much better if we live according to reason instead of according to custom or tradition or authority. And so that is, and that rational control must come from reason, which means especially scientific reason, and that gives sort of oligarchical control, or at least, to the rational controllers, to the scientists, or to those who pretend to have science, or claim to retail to you the benefits or the discoveries of science, so that you can make use of them. The application of science is not by science, but through people who aren't scientists, but who claim to be knowing about science. And that is, I think, a weak part in in the influence or the spread of science into society, and therefore a weak part of the notion of progress.
Yeah, the conservative populist revolt against these liberal elites, that does seem to cut across, though, the progressive.
It
In
does.
that respect, the people are on the side
Yes.
of tradition and custom.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, because the people have common sense. That's another way of speaking of this shoe-pinching argument. That people have common sense, le bon sens of the American people, the good sense. So, that's their resource against science or rational control. Science has to be and is a great enemy of common sense because it replaces common sense. It replaces what most people have thought about things. Most people are prejudiced and superstitious. That's what the scientists say. And there's some truth in that, indeed a good deal of truth in that. But on the other hand, there might be some common sense as well. When I read a social science study, I always judge it by a standard of common sense. And if it accords with common sense, I tend to go with it. And if it doesn't, I reject it.
And you don't think the Enlightenment dreams of enlightening common sense across the board to be more in accord, I suppose, with scientific findings?
Yeah, right.
It's not worked out, maybe.
Yeah.
Over.
Of course, science has a way of imposing itself on its own judges, so that they use scientific terms and even jargon when they're not scientists, sort of not entitled to the use of those terms themselves. So, like the scientific use of the word perception in surveys, as a neutral thing, as not you perceive something, but you're not judging whether it's true or not. You're just believing that it is, perhaps ignorantly. So, that's a kind of rephrasing perception as a word which rephrases the common sense meaning of perceive as perceiving as opposed to being deluded.
And do you think Machiavelli and Tocqueville, maybe one of them, not the other, was also worried about what happens to philosophy when it becomes too visible in the public sphere? I mean, philosophy can also corrupt, so to speak, common sense, or
yes, yeah,
be corrupted, I suppose, and imposed on people. Platonic ideas become the rationale for the churches governing, or
that's
whatever.
right,
Democratic ideas become the rationale for endless democratic progress in a way that, according to Tocqueville, weakens man and so forth. But maybe it's also bad for philosophy. I mean, they might have thought to be out there so much.
You mean Machiavelli and Tocqueville?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's right. That they both.
Aristotle too.
Aristotle. They all. They're wary of philosophy and its pretensions, and
but also protective, maybe, of philosophy.
Protective of philosophy in its from its opponents. Yeah, it can be true to itself, and at the same time not harmed by its enemies, if it doesn't become too visible or too thematic. If it doesn't make a point of the philosophic life as the only good life.
And I suppose the counter-argument to that, I mean, since...
The counter-argument to that is it is the only good life, and that everybody, when you come down to it, really thinks that it's better to accept the guide of reason than of mere custom or tradition.
And I suppose also just that if you don't explicitly make that case, you end up just with,
that's right,
nihilism or something.
Yes,
I mean,
right. Yes, you end up with a stupid custom.
Right. Or one prejudice fighting another.
Yeah, one prejudice fighting another. Yeah.
Because certainly Strauss, who you mentioned, seems to have thought it was important to go out of his way to make the case very explicitly to revive the Socratic case for the philosophic life.
Yes. Among those who follow Strauss, there's a kind of party difference between the ones who take his political reassurances most seriously and those who take his philosophical assertions most seriously. And Strauss himself, sort of laughing, leaves it to each one of his readers to discover or to decide or to think about which is better. Is it better to be with the people with common sense,
Right.
as against pretentious philosophers, or is it better, on the contrary, to recognize the pretentiousness of ordinary people and their resistance to real resistance to thinking, and work against that by bringing out the necessity of philosophy?
Whichever way one comes down on that, it does seem before that you need to understand the fundamental disconnect or tension or
Yes,
between
philosophy and
and
morality, or
society,
philosophy
or
and society,
opinion, yeah.
philosophy and opinion.
That he's pretty intransigent on, I think,
Yeah,
Strauss.
and that he is, yes, yeah.
And that had been forgotten somehow. That's
Yeah.
forgetting of that. It causes all kinds of
That's-
huge problems for
that's
both
right.
society and
That's
philosophy, I suppose.
Yeah, that's the Enlightenment, which Machiavelli began. That philosophy can be translated directly into politics and to morality in such a way as that philosophers can, so to speak, directly rule or preside over society. You got the picture of that in 18th century France, when the authority, the common authority that people would refer to, were the philosophes, the philosophers of the Enlightenment. After that, things became a great deal darker, and Nietzsche took over, and Hitler followed Nietzsche. So pretenders of science and pretenders to philosophy became horrible totalitarian politicians.
And Marx and the Soviet
Marx
Union
and the
similarly.
Soviet Union similarly.
So the recovery of the tension is important for politics as well as for
It is important for, yes,
philosophy,
yeah, for
to understand the limits of what you can do in politics, I suppose.
That's right.
That always seemed to be
Yeah. The
very-
Federalists were very, very understanding of that, yeah. Although they perhaps too somewhat exaggerated the benefits of political science, because they were quite open. If you look at the Federalist, you see it's quite open about the dependence of the new American Republic on political science. And I think that the political science of the Federalists is a lot better than the political science we have today. And so that the handing over to political scientists of sort of the protection of our republic was much wiser in 1787 than it would be today.
Well, somehow, isn't it also in the Federalist of political science that understands the limits of political science? I mean, that's
Yes,
stressed several times.
it is.
And ambition has to counteract ambition, and
That's right. Yeah.
there's limits how clearly
Yeah.
you can delineate things in the
Yes.
human sphere.
And theorists have ambition too, though they may not recognize it.
Right. And so the Federalist is fairly
Yeah.
hostile in a way
It
to
is.
theory.
Yeah, theory.
Right.
Yeah. Sometimes it talks like Machiavelli, the theoretic politicians, or
Right.
Republican theorists, previous ones who didn't recognize necessities. So, yeah, they're somewhat Machiavellian, but in a moral way.
Right.
Yeah, it becomes moral to recognize necessities.
But I think not so much the delusion of rational control
No, that's right.
in the Federalist.
Yeah.
I mean, well, there's some rational
Yeah.
control at the beginning of setting up the system,
Yeah.
maybe, but it doesn't presume
The
excessive.
limit of rational control in the Constitution is that each generation of Americans needs to be as wise as the original generation. That how we practice the Constitution is or can be decisive. We can't take for granted that an institution merely perpetuates itself by being an institution. It has to be. It takes the virtue of the people and of its leaders of every succeeding generation to keep it going. So it's not a perpetual republic in the sense of one that works automatically.
Though the Federalist sometimes gives that impression a little bit, that you think that, it's, once it's set up, it just requires a bunch of ambitious politicians to fight with each other and preserve the separation of powers. And
That's right, it does.
Federalist 10, it's just the
Yeah,
big sphere that'll work out.
that's right.
Yeah.
But still, ambition isn't enough.
Right.
But wisdom is also necessary, and some kind of political wisdom or virtue.
That's particularly clear, maybe the executive, I suppose.
Yeah, sure, for sure. Yeah.
So you're a great critic of rational control, so let me push back a little on that. I mean, couldn't one say, look, of course, there are limits to what one can do in practice, and no one ever gets anything right, and progress isn't, no one can determine ahead of time exactly where progress goes, but is it really a fundamental criticism to say that one has to approximate one's way towards better programs, and one finds new frontiers for equality, but one knows basically what direction one's going, and the fact that people who were championing equality for blacks didn't fully think through the notion of equality for women or for gays, it's still the same principle, basically. So why is it such a problem to say that's kind of what we believe in, sort of a progress towards greater equality, more rational society, more freedom from these customs and prejudices of the past? I mean, does that really, why need that not work, I guess? Or does it need it not work?
Well, yes, because you could say irrational control doesn't work either.
Right.
And, surely philosophy or political philosophy has to do with some understanding of reason and the control of reason. The question is whether that rational control should be entirely devoted to what is material and to what is most obvious about all human beings, namely that they're equal. Aren't there other, let's say, values to keep in mind as well, that those higher things in which our appreciation and capacity differs? And some people are good painters and others aren't, and good musicians, others aren't. So together with the fundamental equality of human beings, you also need to keep in mind the fundamental inequality of human beings. I got into trouble with a friend of mine Harry Jaffa, who likes to speak of the Declaration of Independence and its self-evident truth that all men are created equal, when I said that that's a self-evident half-truth, that there inequalities are just as obvious and in a certain way important as the equalities, and reason, if it's to control, needs to take account of both, and so it's then that you get into trouble. That it's very hard to mix both the way in which we're all equal and the way in which we're all unequal, and that, I think, is perhaps the most fundamental limitation on rational control. Now, the way in which we're most fundamentally unequal is in wisdom, or the capacity to think, or to philosophize. And so this, you could say, is another way of stating the discrepancy between philosophy and society. Society is based on most people's belief that he himself, as an individual, is important, deserves to be respected and not taken for granted. So you could say that the principle of society is, in that way, democratic. In an aristocratic society, those few people who are on top think that they are the most important, and that needs to be that. See, but the philosopher is not. He's not attached to any notion of self-importance, to the extent that his object is to study eternal truths. He studies truths in which individual differences have disappeared. He studies man and not human being, and not specific human beings. But each one of us is a specific human being, and this is reflected in the fact that we all have names. And your name is only yours. And you like people to get it right, if you please. And so if they don't, you correct them and let them know that you're somebody to be noticed. This means that this is a kind of break or on your reason, because it requires you to always maintain in reserve your own self-importance. If it works out that reason tells you you're not important, that you're likely to reject that reason and to stick to your sense of self-importance. Now, and the trouble with science is that it doesn't understand this. Science doesn't understand the resistance to science that comes from people's feeling that they're important. So at MIT, this scientific university, the buildings don't have names; they have numbers,
Right.
and that shows their devotion to science. They're not going to honor some individual human being, especially someone who just has money and isn't really a scientist. But the scientists do have this kind of contradiction that they're interested in Nobel Prizes, and,
Right.
whereas science really is a collective enterprise in which no single human name really should be featured. So the idea of rational control really doesn't understand itself. It doesn't understand the resistance to reason.
And so there could be a fact that people are just very resistant to reason, I guess both ways, right? To democratic reason, in the sense that people want to distinguish themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They want to be known as a better scientist than someone
Yeah.
else. And to, let's call it philosophical reason, maybe that's not quite the right term, but to the reason that would point towards the wisest ruling everyone.
Yeah.
Because people want to say, well, still, I know some things, even if I don't know everything, and I
Yeah.
have some right to say about what,
Right.
show some right to say something about my own choices
Yeah.
and fate.
I'm closer to me than you are.
Right, so that's worth something.
That's
But
worth something.
is this all just a resistance? Is this a resistance that has to be recognized as a practical matter, because obviously society can't function if you don't recognize it? Or is it a resistance that has to be respected somehow? I mean, I guess that would be the question.
Yeah, it's a resistance, I think, that needs to be respected somehow because it represents unreason. So, and there's plenty of unreason in the universe. And some of it is even found in human beings who are, you could say, the source of reason, perhaps, the only source of intelligence that we've found so far. But even within our own souls, there's this unreason that we're each of us attached to his own matter or to his own body in a way that no one else is. And so, this realization that you have within your souls and passions which take you away from reason or make you unruly, that's each person. If you realize this in your own psychology, you have in a way an entrance into the greatest metaphysical problem, which is, you could say, the distinction between what is intelligent and what is unintelligent, or what is reasoning, what is life or awareness of life, and what is not, what is simply dead matter. And I think it is important for people of reason to see the importance of non-reason. When a scientist deals with the universe, say a physicist, astrophysicist, or those, speaking of big bangs and dark clouds or whatever, dark stars, whatever, dark spaces. It has to realize that in this universe there's also the scientist himself who is using his intelligence to understand or try to make intelligible what doesn't have intelligence. And so that and usually it doesn't. Usually the scientific theory, as opposed to the philosophic one, scientific theory only looks at everything as if it were matter and not as if it had awareness or intelligence as well. And therefore modern physics is materialistic and really one-sided. And this is just like the democratic one-sidedness of the idea of rational control when it comes to politics and society.
I suppose it's also true, I mean, just from a simple-minded view of the account of the Republic of the Soul or whatever, that you wouldn't even have the reason or maybe the impulse to reason without these less reasonable parts of the soul, right?
Well, that's true too.
So that
yes.
There's a way in which we should be respectful of them for
yes, for helping us to raise our problems. Yes,
right.
Right.
Wonder,
so
we want to be free, and then we wonder about what it means to be free, or we want
that's
to,
right. Yeah. Whereas if we were purely wise and capable of ignoring our bodies and of everything that's required because of our bodies, namely all morality, if we were like that, then we wouldn't really have any problems. We would just fit in. We would adapt. And our reasoning would be adjusting to natural necessities. But no, as we say, we push back.
Right.
And that means resist, and that means insist on ourselves. But reason needs to insist on itself. So reason itself needs to become or take something from human assertiveness, which is because when you resist something, you're always and saying no. Just say no. It's never enough just to say no, right. because behind that no is always a yes. So behind our resistance to reason is always some reason why we want to say no, and that's a positive thing. So reason resisting on its own behalf is also asserting its own importance. And this means asserting the importance of human beings and thus justifying the fact that each one of us wants to have an individual name.
And that comes from a sort of a certain kind of desire to be free and different and distinguished, yes. I suppose. And
that's right.
Distinct from everyone else and everything else.
Right, right.
There's also the kind of, the love of the wonder and the love of the truth that seems, maybe that's a different psychological source, though, the wish not to simply fit in the sense of never thinking about what you're doing. I mean, that would be another alternative, I suppose, right?
Yeah. It's both making a whole of things and seeing the true distinctions in things.
Right.
So reason is both of those, and it has to assert itself, insist on itself, as well as take a modest role and admit that no particular human being is of that terrific importance.
And today you've written about manliness. I mean, that's related to this discussion.
Manliness is always related to any political discussion.
Right.
Yeah, manliness is the special insistence on importance that males seem to specialize in. The idea of a man who takes charge of a risky affair when rational control is not available, or when there's no obvious or easy answer, when something has to be done to overcome threatening conditions, and you have to take a risk and be courageous. The Greek word for courage is the same as the Greek word for manly.
And presumably the contingencies of life and politics are such that you're not sure that something will work
That's
out,
right.
so you need to have that ability to...
And you could say that kind of manliness in that sense could apply to the scientist as well, that they take a risk in challenging things that have always been taken for granted, and looking to see some new way, some innovation. We nowadays take innovation so much for granted, but it's a risk. It's a risk for a businessman. The entrepreneurial spirit, that's kind of manliness,
right.
or or courage. People who not only face risk but actually prefer that or like an interesting life, an adventurous life. Adventure is part of modernity too.
Right.
Conformity and rational control is one side, but adventure is also an important side. I have a student named Bruno Messias who wrote his dissertation on modern adventurousness. He's in politics now.
That's right. But even for the scientists, I think I'm struck by that. They don't really want to work extremely hard to confirm for 30 or 40 years, to confirm what is already known about the universe. They would sort of like to make a breakthrough.
That's right, yeah.
You know, somehow not simply a devotion to scientific progress, though it is partly that, but also kind of, they want to make their own mark and change the status quo. And
because you make your own mark by changing.
And since you wrote the manliness book, are you more cheered up or more depressed about the prospects for manliness? The health of manliness.
I can't say I'm cheered up, no.
Is that right? You haven't turned things around despite taking that risk?
Somehow, yes. Somehow I've been, quite thoroughly not listened to.
Oh, no. That's always the prelude to being truly listened to, though, you know. Allegedly.
All right. Well, we'll see, won't we?
Right, we will. Thank you, Harvey, for joining us today in our conversation, and we'll see you next time in Conversations.